Welcome to Hauger History Podcast number 95, picking up where 94 left off with more detail. I'm Mr. Hauger, and I'm here with Expo. Expo, how's it going?
Good, and you?
I'm doing great. I'm just surprised that that's the name we picked, but I like it, and now it's final. And so, Expo, we're here talking about World War II and essentially a summarizing and synopsis of some of the high points or low points, depending on how you look at history, and coming to the conclusion of World War II. So before we start, as I should kind of start every exam, I want to explore some of the context. So in the United States, before we go into the fighting and we're brought in at Pearl Harbor, what was going on domestically in the United States? What's kind of the feel of America during that time? What are a few things that are happening?
Well, I remember that the Roaring Twenties was going on, which was like kind of a huge impact on the things that started to flow down after that, which was ended up being the Great Depression and our kind of isolation with other countries just because of fear of our economy being taken over, other situations.
Absolutely. I mean, there were a lot of tariffs in place that were preventing trade, so we're staying on our own, letting Europe handle European affairs. And there was the pledge from FDR when he got reelected that your boys are not going to be sent overseas. Like, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to go into that. The Roaring Twenties that you mentioned brought culture, music, common American traits, entertainment, film, a celebratory decade, even while some of the rest of the world was suffering with the events that would lead to World War II. Mm-hmm. So depression that you mentioned had a hold on the whole country and the world, with high unemployment, industry was suffering, trade, as I said, was not going well. So there were like a fractured world in a lot of ways, and the United States was trying to come out of that and recover. So we weren't fully out of that, which is probably why we declared the isolationist policy at all. The Axis powers come up with the rise of fascism and dictators and totalitarianism, with Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the United States, England, and France get drawn into conflict and war. One vast difference between American ideals and fascist ideals. Let's talk about a few different perspectives that I know we're speaking from the American classroom perspective. That's just where we are. But what are some of the differences? What's more important in a fascist state? Is it the individual or is it the country?
It's the country.
It's the country. The country comes first. The communal good of everyone comes first, and the nation's development comes before individual freedoms. Mm-hmm. So what can you not do in a fascist country like Germany or Italy during this time that you could do in the United States freely?
I don't think you can protest publicly.
You wouldn't be able to, or if you did, you would be at serious risk.
Yeah.
You didn't have those rights protected during that time. So that's a good point. Well said. A single-party state is something that we talked about a lot, and one of the terms that's commonly used during this era to describe a Mussolini or a Hitler or any dictator that we talk about, besides fascist, is also the word what?
Totalitarian?
Exactly. And you could think total, like in total control of the nation. Very good. At first, we wanted to stay out of a war, and Europe wanted to stay out of a war. So when we went to meetings like the Munich Pact, which we're going to talk about, which Germany annexed Czechoslovakia, we decided to let them have it. It's a small piece of land. Let's avoid war, and that will maybe stop his quench and thirst for more land and power. Right. Before that, though, that policy had a name, and during that time, that policy had a name. What was it?
Appeasement.
It was appeasement. Yeah, very good. So let's give him something. Let's make him feel like he's had some recovery, because Germany was wrecked after World War I too. So there you go. So that was the Munich Pact. So during the time of Japan, they were suffering economic hardships as well. So they replaced their democracy with a military leader, and Hideki Tojo takes over. In Russia, we have the death of Lenin, so Joseph Stalin takes over. He has drastic implications for what will happen there, and the ideology of ideology. That's a few extra syllables, but we like to give you more on the podcast just to help you study, even if it's just more syllables. Extra emphasis is exactly right. So Germany is fighting England and bombing England. It's been invading France. It's been invading Poland. Then they make a drastic turn because they want to avoid what they did in World War I, getting bogged down and getting into slow war. So they take the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, and what direction do they go next?
They ended up heading east.
They went east to Russia. And that was a drastic turning point in the war, especially when it comes to winter and some of the harsh conditions there that would become some of their fiercest enemies through the combat. Mm-hmm. So definitely that's a major point in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa when they turned east to Russia. At that time, with Germany going east to Russia, war spreading to more and more countries, Japan looking to expand their living space and empire, going into China and Manchuria, taking over islands in Korea, and doing just a lot of work in the area, we start realizing that, okay, even if the United States is not fighting, we'll create this Lend-Lease Act so we can create supplies. what kind of supplies, what kind of support did the United States help its allies with? What are some of the things?
I feel like most of it came from like military goods, so like guns or maybe ammunition.
Sure.
Most likely like repairs for like anything necessary to repair.
Yeah, like service assistance too,
Right.
exactly, and repairs, and food, and selling planes. I think the leasing means like the borrowing, like when you lease a car, right? So even leasing tanks and planes and say, hey, come pick it up and take it away and go use it. So we weren't fighting, but we were active.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's talked about a lot when I was a student, and I think it helps you understand why, like when we cut off oil supply to Japan, that's huge. They need oil for everything that they're trying to do at that time.
Right.
So it's when you put an embargo on somebody, it's not political, but it's political at the same time. It's pressure, right? It's economic, but everyone knows that economies are tied to the success of nations. So that's part of the reason that Tojo was so frustrated and started planning the attacks in Pearl Harbor. In our narrative here, at least in the United States, that's the part that we're getting from our text and from our research that we're learning. So the attacks at Pearl Harbor, how many casualties were suffered there, Expo?
It was about 2,000 or so.
Yeah, about 2,000, around 2,300. And estimates on death are difficult based on who died that day, who died as a result, who had lasting damage that shortened their life. I mean, it's hard to count numbers, which is why even for World War II, we get like 50 million. But I had a book before this book that said 60 million. And I've seen books say 70 if you count starvation. And just, I mean, the tolls of damage.
Right, and you want to allow like those lives to be accountable and not just looked over.
Well, that seems to be important nowadays when we count casualties in lots of things and circumstances. So that's an interesting thing to bring up for sure. So after Pearl Harbor, who declares war on Japan?
The U.S.
The United States declares war, and based on the Allies, then Germany and Italy declare war on the United States in the following days, weeks. And life changes in the United States. Women go to work to replace the 16 million soldiers that serve. Everyone's kind of in the state of tension, and is San Francisco going to be under attack? Now, we're not testing on that, but in our class, we talked a lot about how the Bay Area transformed, and $650 million for shipbuilding and development for camps and training and military zones, and we spent a lot of time on that. I didn't put it on the exam, but I think that's important to remember, and I kind of feel like when I can't remember something on a test, if I can remember more of the conversation, sometimes it'll like wake up a part of the other brain that it was struggling for answers. What's our response? What do we do towards Japanese Americans that are living near the coast and coastal states? What happens to them?
I think because of like our fear, we kind of just had to set them in, their own segregated conditions. So the internment camps and
the fear, I think, plays largely. You mentioned it. Yeah. So the internment camps, the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 roughly which were citizens, and also the internment of thousands of German Americans and Italian Americans as well. Not nearly the numbers of Japanese Americans that were put in camps, but that happens. We start rationing food to control supplies, make sure we have enough metal, bullets, guns, ammunitions, food, clothing to send overseas for 16 million people to serve. So our economy converts to a war economy. The amount of women working increases, and the African Americans go out and serve as well in numbers. Over 1 million African Americans go and serve the United States side and Army. What is unique about the way that they served? Were they, on our test it's multiple choice, could they not enlist? Were they not paid? Could they not fly? Or did they serve in segregation?
It was definitely like a sense of segregation just because of their color at the time.
Right.
It wasn't looked at as an equal, position in the military. So they were definitely placed in their own,
units and troops, and commanded typically by white soldiers. But over the time, the accomplishments of like the Tuskegee Airmen or the Battalion of Anti-Aircraft Tanks, they proved merit, they proved worth, they proved that they could do anything on the battlefield. And some of that acknowledgement from Harry Truman would come later, and they would desegregate the military, I believe in 1948. So there's like an interesting sub-note here about sacrifice of all different kinds of Americans that are there. And even though we weren't responding in the most progressive way at the time with people that were put into internment, which is not something that is a happy part of our history, there was this fight for like women's rights and civil rights. But it wasn't so much of like, maybe it wasn't so much of a protest. Again, I wasn't living in the 40s, so I'm sure there were protests.
Yeah, for sure.
But it was like accomplishment and the awareness of what was happening and having to realize, wow, everyone had to participate for this effort to be successful, which is not, explicitly written here in an essay, but it's just important to understand that as part of the story. So 16 million served, 156,000 allies invade during D-Day. We went through that museum activity day where we talked about D-Day. And now we have to close the war. We're getting towards the end and the end of the episode. We're dragging a little bit. But it's an extensive war. There's so many topics. We've been at this for weeks. So let's close off with island hopping. As a strategy, it was extremely difficult. Expo hasn't learned this part yet. He's got this in class today, which is it's just an amazing name. I'm still stunned by that.
Me too.
But you're hopping from island to island. You're totally isolated, so you're distant from supplies. We didn't really have the aircraft we have now that could refuel in flight and drop so many things. We're far away from our support bases. So you can only attack from air and sea, which meant 3, that there were no way of coming to a surprise attack. 4, you had to defend everything you took, which could be difficult and cost you a lot of lives. 5, you had to fight in from the trenches, and oftentimes it was a difficult push straight into bullet fire when you land on the beach. 6, it created a cycle of war. And 7, you end up with prisoners that, what are you going to do? You're on an island. Sometimes you disarm them, or you execute them, or you leave them there. You have all sorts of problems created from this type of warfare, which made it very difficult and challenging for the people who were serving to control those islands during that time. That leaves us with only a couple more things to cover. We have direct withdrawal of paychecks from the Internal Revenue Act of 1942. I feel like that question should have been 10 questions earlier, if I'm going to be chronological. How did World War II end in Europe? So Germany has one last counter push, one big counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. They've got tanks and 4,500 anti-aircraft guns, and the weather was cloudy, so American bombers had a tough time finding their targets. The skies cleared. The attacks of the Allies become more successful. Germany runs out of ammunition. They stop proceeding. They're stopped in their tracks. This last big counteroffensive of Germany fails. Weeks later, surrender, Adolf Hitler, suicide after his marriage, and he's in a bunker. And that's the end of the war in Europe. Japan's still fighting, though. So 2 atomic bombs, August 6th and 9th. 230,000 casualties directly from those bombs. And Harry Truman, basically, after the death of FDR, saying, hey, this is going to cause civilian deaths. It's going to be, I don't know if it was his first line of consideration, but it's going to prevent a war of the United States invading Tokyo and invading mainland Japan. And in our class today, we're going to go through the traumatic effects of what that bomb does to you, what the pressure waves do, what happened to the ground, what happened to the people, what happened in a 5-mile range, a 10-mile range, what happened in a larger scale of things. And we're going to listen to President Truman's address to hear the primary source of, like, what were his intentions and what did he tell the American people at that time. And that brings the war to an end. So there were a lot of gruesome details through these weeks. I mean, we looked at a lot of stories. We looked at a lot of journeys. We looked at a lot of individual soldiers and their accomplishments. But for now, that's the end of our formal assessment. Although I always tell, like, we're not just trying to teach to a test here. We're trying to understand the larger narrative of what happened. So thank you so much for joining us on this review and podcast. We hope that you got a lot from this review as well, wherever you're watching from, whether it's our school or others. And wishing you the best in your future studies. If you have any questions, comment below. And we'll talk to you on the next edition. Expo, anything else?
No. Have a good day, guys.
Have a good day. Class is dismissed. Talk to you later.